governance and public policy at Goa University. And she's also pursuing her PhD in sovereign financing at St. Joseph's International University as well. And here we are moving into muddy or, I would say, turbulent waters, because we're talking about the Tempest of the 21st century, navigating the economic impact of sea level rise on coastal Asia's public debt. So, Bobby, the floor and yours in minutes. It was a life.
Thank you, Professor. Boa tarde and a very good afternoon to everyone present here. As said, the title is quite dramatic, so is my research. It is the tempest of the 21st century that is almost a storm, where we will try to navigate the economic impact of sea level rise on coastal Asia's public debt. A brief structure, what I'm going to speak in 15 minutes, the introduction, literature, research questions, methodology, the analysis. I will try to tame the tides. I have realized via my past experiences that having a very optimistic view about international law is not always good. So I'm just trying to control my optimism in this presentation. Okay, so where did this topic start? I come from this place called Goa, a small coastal state in India. And as of March 2023, Goa's total outstanding debt is Indian rupees 31,104 crores, which converts to around 3.7 billion US dollars. Now, at the same time, the sea level rise, which Goa, the state of Goa is facing, is 1.5 millimeters per year. Not a lot, and I live right next to the beach. During a conversation with an NIO, National Institute of Oceanographic scientific officer, I said, sea level rise, it's just 1.5 millimeter per year, it doesn't matter. It's just this much. He was like, yeah, you're right, but have you seen the floods? The pictures that you see below are from the monsoon season. So we have 4 months of monsoon. And the area which Goa is a low-lying area. So during monsoon, what happens is, automatically the sea level rises and the roads are at the same level as the sea. So where does the water go? Nowhere. It floods. That is the path I had to take while going to the college every day. That's the bus. That's right next to the beach, the middle one, and the next is in the south of Goa, a village which is almost underwater. So now, what is to be done? Now, the government recently built a very fancy place called the Promenade. And I was like, what is the point of all of this? So you're simply wasting public money. Until I realized that it was something which was done to protect the coast. It was a Mandovi Promenade dive which had to be constructed. And that made me realize that, yes, expenditure is being incurred due to sea level rise. And my aim for this research is to identify and recommend policy measures that government and the international law can be used as it is, not recommending any new law or any new government institute, international organization being formed, which can adopt laws which can be adopted to reduce the debt burden and have climate resilience, ensuring economic stability while addressing sea level rise threat. The objectives that I have taken are 2, which I will be researching on, which is to critically examine the relationship between sea level rise. Is there any relationship between sea level rise and rising public debt, or is it just something which is happening coincidentally? And secondly, I have taken a great courage to challenge the Nordos DICE model. He received in 2018 the Nobel Prize for Economics went to this model. So a bit about the literature. The global public debt is currently USD 97 trillion in 2023, with Asia and Oceania region holding 27% of the global public debt, according to United Nations Trade and Development statistics. Now, what is the result? Why is public debt important? Because it creates a fiscal pressure on each and every government. What happens because of this fiscal pressure, especially in developing countries, when they are not able to address their developmental needs, their health and education? How would they resort to climate resilience? Secondly, it leads to sovereign debt crisis, something which we have seen in Sri Lanka, not akin or not because of climate crisis, but rather what would Sri Lanka now do when it does not have money and its sea levels are rising? Fourthly, it reduces the fiscal stability and it affects the monetary policy of each and every nation. Now, about sea level rise, the IPCC's assessment report has stated what would be the amount of sea level rise, and so has the NASA's projection tool, which says that in certain scenarios, how much sea level would rise. Now, what is the impact of sea level rise? Throughout the day, we have been seeing that it would lead to loss of coastal infrastructure, loss of tourism especially where the sea level rises, loss of agricultural land and the GDP which comes out of agriculture, increasing cost of coastal defense. Singapore is quite an example. In 2022, I believe the government in the parliament speech said that they are going to commit $100 billion for building of sea walls and tanks. So those are the coastal defenses, displacement cost, and then finally adaptation and resilience cost would increase because of sea level rise. So this is the upward trending chart of sea level rise. Now coming to how I have went about this research. So these are my two research questions which we have stated. The data collected for the first research question majorly comes from IMF, World Bank, IPCC and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development reports and peer-reviewed journals. Then my method is quantitative analysis to assess the correlation between sea level rise and public debt. A regression model is used in order to showcase that yes or no, whether there is a relationship between sea level rise and public debt. Later on, in order to prove it further, I have used stratified random sampling method, wherein I have taken 6 countries based on their debt levels and explained and thoroughly researched them. And finally, to analyze it, once again, the outcome of the regression method and climate resilience expenditures have been analyzed. With the second research question, my method has been pretty simple and straightforward. Check the DICE model that is, and the RICE model at the same time. We will see what it is. And analyze what it says about economy and climate change. Now, coming to the first research question, does sea level rise directly impact public debt of coastal Asia? Now, what is public debt and what public debt have I chosen here? The public debt is basically the amount of money that a government owes and used in its developmental projects to cover budget deficits. It is also known as sovereign debt, national debt, and so on. It is determined basically based by using central government debt to GDP ratio, and this is what I have used. My data sources have been the central government debt provided by the International Monetary Fund and the trade economics for the finalizing my details. Now this is the data that you can see. The first chart basically speaks about the percentage change in the debt to GDP ratio in the year 2015 to 2022. Taking all the data from 2015, what was the percentage change? So how much debt did one country, the first one, East Timor, incur in 2015 and then in 2022? The basis of 2015 is because it was when the economy was considerably stable, and 2022 it was after the COVID pandemic when economies were stabilizing. So as you can see, only 3 countries have a negative relation, that is, are not doing very bad. That is Vietnam, Taiwan and Brunei. These countries show that yes, as compared to 2015, their debt to GDP ratio is pretty good. But rest of the countries that have been chosen in coastal Asia are showcasing a positive trend. That is, their debt to GDP ratio is increasing and has been increasing as compared to 2015 and 22. The other chart we see here is the sea level rise. What has been the sea level rise from the highest to the lowest? We see Bangladesh first. Once again, what is first on the first chart? That is East Timor is second in the second chart. So is there any connection? So this is the chart which we come up with, and we can see the red line, which is a positive trend, a slightly skewed upwards, which shows that yes, there is a positive relationship between the rate of sea level rise and the percentage change in debt to GDP ratio. Now, secondly, the scattering and the variations that we can see around the line, specifically in the left hand side. We can see that yes, there is a trend, however the relationship is quite not certain, because if the relationship was certain, all the dots would have been on the red line. So we need to go a bit into detail and see that. The third thing we see is the outliners. We see Bangladesh, a country wherein debt to GDP ratio is a bit less, but the sea level rise is quite high. So why is that? In order to study that, we have gone into further specific research into Bangladesh. And with regard to clustering, so many countries at one side showcase that all these South Asian countries have something similar or something in common, which is the relationship of rate of sea level rise and the percentage change is common throughout the coastal Asia. And the range of data is basically what can happen in the future that is depicted by the red line. Now going into the stratified study. So what I have done here is of all the countries, I had listed around 35 countries in the beginning which exist in coastal Asia. I eliminated the Middle East because they are majorly based on, they are majorly oil exporting countries and their economy cannot be considered at the same level as the other countries on the east side, which are based more on agriculture, tourism, and so on. And here we have countries which have Singapore, Japan, and Sri Lanka are high debt countries where their debt to GDP ratio is quite high. Then Indonesia, Vietnam, and Bangladesh have low debt to GDP ratio. And then Thailand, India, and Malaysia have a medium debt to. This is based on the IMF estimate that 55% of debt to GDP ratio is like the mid-range that a country should have. Now, if we look at this thoroughly, the columns here are basically what is the estimated economic loss due to sea level rise, what is the projected cost of coastal defense, and at the same time, what is the projected GDP growth annually as of now of each of these countries, and what is, as per 2023, what is the current GDP of these countries. So what we can see is, although certain countries can eliminate the economic loss by, let's say, suppose the government establishing dikes and taking measures, your cost would increase and the loss would decrease. So it's never going to be a win-win situation. You have to invest money. The governments have to invest money in order for climate resilience, in order for them to adapt. What we have seen in today's session, and what I believe is that all of us have agreed that sea level is inevitable. Sea level rise is inevitable, and what we are moving towards is adapting to sea level rise, and which shows that in order to adapt, you need to put in a lot of finance. And developing countries, where do they get this finance from? Either you borrow, or you just face the sea level rise. Even if you borrow, they are currently debt ridden. The world is going into debt. We have seen that it is 97.3 trillion. The world is 97.3 trillion debt. So where do we get this money from? Particular observations with regard to each of the 9 points are, for example, in Singapore, high cost for relocation and defense can be seen. However, at the same time, we must realize that the GDP of Singapore and the assets which are owned by them is quite high. So they are actually in a better position to manage the sea level rise and the consequences of it. But when it comes to Sri Lanka, which has been recently in economic crisis, how can it manage to reduce the economic loss at the same time the coastal defense investments? How can it make that rather than relying on the Asian Development Bank or outside financing? But once again, would it be in kind? No, they would have to repay the loans, and that would once again lead to increase in the debt. So while reading Nordhaus paper, I came across, he quoted Keynes, and he said that it is better to be partly correct than absolutely wrong. And I believe with this, the results which I have come up with my research question 1, that yes, coastal defense cost and economic losses go hand in hand. There is no win-win situation for anyone here. So it is necessary that we need to find solutions in order to manage the debt. Secondly, GDP growth and sea level rise, once again, growth rates remain stable, but it will face the climate change impacts. Secondly, the adaptive capacity require a lot of investments from these developing countries. Now that brings me to the Nordhaus DICE model, which whether it is effective in assessing economic impact of coastal regions. Now the answer on the face of it is no. It is a global model, and the global model basically assesses what is the pattern, or it tries to establish relationship between climate change and economy. Because to be frank, as Professor said in the beginning, there are academicians and there are state practices. State would not have any practice if it does not affect it economically. That is what we have been seeing in this session. So this is the first model which tried to bring in any relationship between them. And the DICE model is effectively being used by the United States in order to assess its social cost of carbon, The RICE model, that is the regional integrated climate economy model, is being used by the European Union in order to assess once again its adaptation to climate change. So quickly going over what this model basically says in brief is there is economic dynamics and there is climate dynamics. Economic dynamics means that in order to progress, in order to increase your GDP, what you do is you come up with plants, industries. What this leads to is emissions and carbon dioxide in the environment. That leads to a carbon sink. Now what happens because of the carbon dioxide in the environment? There is climate dynamics, that is the greenhouse GHG is increasing and subsequently sea level rise, the temperature increases. And that leads to damage functions. Now what is damage function? The damage which is caused because of the economic dynamics to the climate is your damage function, which leads to loss to your GDP. What do you do then? Then you have more industries. Why? Because you need to protect your environment, so you keep going through this cycle, and this is the cycle which is explained by Norcos. Now this is once again he has tried to project what is going to be the emissions of carbon dioxide if we have these policy measures. So the baseline is we do not change the current scenario. If we keep going as it is, the yellow line is the trend line. The Paris, if we continue to follow the Paris Agreement, then it is a dotted orange line, and so on. These are basically the climate policy methods which the paper has tried to explain. Now the key observations from this are, yes, we can use the DICE model in order to strengthen our argument with regard to climate change and sea level rise. However, in order to use it for our regional assessment, it falls short because it's a global model. Even the regional model only uses the GHGs and nothing more. It does not take into account the sea level rise. So a model probably along the lines of this, the DICE model specifically for sea level rise, is something which economists and lawyers need to come up with. Now that brings me to the solution, taming the tides. And can we tame it? And do we need to tame it? The answer is yes, because the world is going into debt. The world is facing sea level rise. So what can we do? So here I have proposed solutions within the existing framework. I am not trying to bring up any new laws, but trying to use provisions in these in the existing international frameworks for debt management, at the same time managing the sea level rise. So the 4 solutions are given are debt restructuring with climate conditions, debt for climate swaps, climate bonds with debt management provisions, and sovereign debt contracts with climate clauses. So each of these has provision. So for example, let's just take the first one. In the UNFCCC Article 4 speaks about the commitment. Now it directly does not say that we need to have debt restructuring for climate conditions, but rather it is used, or it can be used to propose a solution which is of that nature. That is the solution that I am giving. Secondly, drawing from the second session, ASEAN Agreement on Disaster Management and Emergency Response, Article 6 can be used, wherein the ASEAN region within themselves, because it's finally an economic model, which can allow for regional cooperation on debt restructuring. This can be utilized. Then the IMF Regional Debt Sustainability Framework is something for the low-income countries, which is not directly for the coastal Asian regions, but it can be utilized as well. I hope I'm within the... Okay. So let us go to the simulations here. These solutions which I have proposed, I have tried to conduct a simulation based on the data which I have collected. So the first simulation is debt restructuring. I have taken the example of Sri Lanka and how by using the UNFCCC Article 4 related to climate adaptation, Sri Lanka can possibly reduce its debt by 5 to 10%. So what it basically does is it commits to its debtors that 5 to 10% of the debt would be used for SLR adaptation, and it does use that for sea dikes or erosion control. What this leads to is there is reduction in debt, and the same money is diverted instead of refinancing to coastal protection. Similarly, for debt for climate swaps, we have taken the example of Indonesia, where once again Indonesia reduces its debt to 34 to 35% by saying that I will use 5 to 8%. It swaps it for climate benefit purpose or sea level rise resilience. Similarly, Vietnam climate bonds with debt management provision. Vietnam issues these bonds which have this provision implied in it, saying that in case of any calamities related to sea level rise, debt can be repayment can be further extended. Finally, Japan sovereign debt contracts. This is the most difficult one, I believe, because it finally depends on the creditor as well. Speaking about the examples that we have given. In conclusion, I would say that there are various challenges even to the solution I have proposed because debt cancellation is not a solution. But managing this debt while ensuring sea level rise can be managed is something which countries should go forward to. There are these issues that can be faced, but the tides will increase. May increase, but it will increase. But finally, we are the masters of our fate, and each nation, especially the coastal Asia, must strive together in order to manage its debt at the same time the rising sea level. Thank you.
Thank you. And indeed, cancellation of debt will not be an option. I wonder if cancellation of human lives might be a trigger to do something about that, because I guess this is where we're heading to. I'm sorry for the catastrophic note, but I guess there are three takeaways that I tried to sum up these three presentations, which essentially talk about money, and I see three vicious circles here, which can hopefully trigger a bigger conversation. So the first one that I see really is that first, the more we need investments, financial flows to achieve climate adaptation goals, because we have international agreed climate adaptation goals as well, I would say the more hard regulatory choices will be developed domestically. And when I speak about investment treaties, as was said in the first presentation, of course, the regulatory chill trap is always there. The second vicious cycle that I see is that the more people will look after themselves to mitigate climate change and get more unilaterally about this, the more they will be exposed to trade wars and basically as weaponized by WTO law. Because again, climate change is an exception. It's something that is not good for business. And this should be justified, of course, when you restrict free movement of goods and when you put public money into the picture. So this is another vicious circle that maybe should be thought of. And the third one, which is very clear, I think, is the more need for adaptation, the more sea level rise, the more public debt. This is very clear. Although I see that there are some silver linings there. With this kind of poor takeaway of mine, I will just open the floor for 10 minutes for questions. I will have to leave, unfortunately, at 4 p.m. your time. I guess Eileen is there on the ground to take any questions in person. Q&A is open online for those of you who are on screen. I see some mic moving, so I guess the question is coming.
Thank you everyone for your great presentations. My questions to the second speaker. You were talking about WTO cases and how we can locate climate change related jurisprudence there. But don't you feel that WTO is not the correct forum, not the correct court when it comes to locating the appropriate jurisprudence on climate change? Because just like all other international organizations, WTO is also guided by a treaty, that is the Marrakesh Agreement. And if we look at the objectives, the preamble and the objectives of the Marrakesh Agreement, there is absolutely no mention of environmental conservation. There might be a mention of sustainable development, but that is having a whole together different connotation attached to it. So even though we suffer from what is called fragmentation of international law, but looking at the WTO decisions which touch upon environmental issues is not the right way to approach climate change related legal issues. Thank you.
Answer now or later? I think your chair will determine that, but let's maybe get a few more questions, I guess. Yes, so we have a question.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, this is like an excellent panel, and I think these are the issues that, the economic issues, investment, trade, and I think what you talked about, public debt, have been really under the radar and now have come up. And I think it's again the situation where the framework did not contemplate climate change. And here we are, this whole issue of law and readapting law. But investment, unlike WTO, there isn't, I mean, it's very diffuse. And I mean, particularly investment arbitration world. And some of the awards coming out are shocking and really putting states in a position where they cannot meet their, potentially cannot meet their pairs. So there's institute trials going through some reformations, but what do you think? You know, how are we going to get there? And then on yours for the public debt, very, very, very interesting. I have to tell you that I think I have to watch it several times over to really digest all those numbers, but I think it's so important what you've done. Why are you looking at debt restructuring? Because what about finance and loss and damage and the Green Climate Fund? Why should these countries have to restructure debt? Or shouldn't it that it should be debt relief, actually, in terms of who's responsible for that? I think that's the big debate going on. So I'll stop here.
Maybe one more question?
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists for very fascinating presentations. I have a question for Roxana specifically, because I think the question, or perhaps the art of treaty interpretation is very interesting when we look at how to keep existing treaties adept to deal with environmental challenges. And I think the ICLOS was recently faced with this question when we had to determine the climate change nexus between UNCLOS and the protection of the marine environment. The UNCLOS doesn't really say anything about climate change, but of course one of the objectives of UNCLOS is to protect the marine environment. Greenhouse gas emissions causes marine environmental pollution, so they can interpret the UNCLOS in light of other relevant rules of international law applicable between the parties. So I was wondering, when we talk about investment treaties that might either be entirely silent on environmental issues, might include at best a sort of weak reference, or don't really have environmental protection as their purpose. How can we determine what is relevant rules of international law? Is it at all possible to make sort of environmental treaties relevant in this regard, or do we need sort of firmer provisions?
I think that we can have the answer.
Should I start or should I go in reverse?
Maybe in the order.
Okay. Thank you so much for the questions. On the first question, I think UNCITRAL is working on investment arbitration reform, and it focuses on making procedural issues and restructuring of investment tribunals into something like investment court, and that was one of the proposals made by the European delegation, the European Union, supported by some others. The problem, though, is that they explicitly excluded all the substantive investment standards from consideration. That's number one. And number two, they also excluded any kind of sustainability concerns, even though some delegations, for example, South African delegation, raised the idea that we need to speak about sustainable development. Well, the UNCITRAL Secretariat sort of adopted the mandate of the proceduralist reform, chose to avoid this kind of conversation. And they keep repeating, right? We're going to focus on the issues of procedure, even though one can make an argument that, well, not all questions that you can define as procedural are purely procedural. They can have substantive law implications, right? The issue of counterweight